Hi, everyone, and thanks a lot for tuning in for this episode of Surfed. Today, we are going to dive into something at the very center of every school, the meals our children eat. The expectations of these meals have never been higher, both in terms of nutrition, quality, support for well being. But despite that, we are seeing that the funding isn't keeping up. Last year, England's funding per meal increased by just 3p to 2.6. And if you compare that to Wales, where it's at 3.4, Scotland 3.3, and Northern Ireland 3.1, you can see there is a very, very big difference between that. Today, we'll really dive in with two deep knowledge experts about the real cost of school meals and also the levers operators have, the roles of free school meals, and also the trade-offs between cost, quality, etc. So really, really happy to dive into this. I'm Peter, the CEO and co-founder of Canbla. And with me today, I have Luke Consigler, who is the CEO of The Pantry, and Brian Lygate, who's the Chief Operating Officer at Impact Food Group. But I'd like to give the word over to you guys to give a quick introduction of yourself, and then we'll dive into this exciting theme. Maybe starting with you, Luke.
Yeah, so as you said, I'm the CEO of an education caterer called The Pantry, and I also am a director. I sit on the national board for the School Food People, where I represent London and the southeast of England.
Very nice. And you, Brian?
Yep. I'm Brian Lygate. I'm the Chief Operating Officer of Impact Food Group. We look after over 1,700 schools across England, and that's primary, secondary, and colleges. And then I wear another hat, which is I'm on the board of directors and the vice chair of the School Food People, representing the frontline workers of school catering across local authorities, multi-academy trusts, caterers and suppliers within the sector.
Very nice. I, of course, as your introduction, gave a little bit of an intro to the theme and a little bit of introduction to the current funding, but there will be some people that are sitting and watching this that know nothing about this space and UK funding and generally about the free school meal, etc. And there'll be others that are experts. So I think maybe before we dive in, if it would be possible maybe for one of you to give a little introduction into maybe the journey of this and the story of this and what are some of the current troubles and the current situation in the UK regarding free school meal.
Yeah, so I think when it comes to school meals, the real challenge is for everyone, schools and caterers, the funding hasn't kept up with inflation. So like you said earlier, that's £2.61 within England, and it's much higher within Wales, Scotland and Northern Ireland. And there's a disparity there. While schools believe there's 261 there, actually it's a wider funding problem for schools. So as Luke and I discuss all the time, we will not compromise on the quality of the ingredients, the meals that we provide, and we have to provide a main meal and dessert every day, but we will not compromise on that quality. So what happens is schools have to end up essentially paying a subsidy or paying more towards a service to maintain that quality. So it goes back to that the meal price doesn't cover, or the funding available doesn't cover the quality of meals required from the school food standards. And that's what's became a real challenge over the years, because it's essentially just not kept up with inflation. If we think back to just after COVID, food inflation was rampant. We then had great wage increases for our teams, which is fantastic. However, the funding model from the government has not kept up to keep schools essentially well funded to provide those meals. And that's why schools now are having to pay that subsidy. So it's put them in a very difficult position.
And as you alluded to, Peter, just to say, you mentioned before that there's some people who are experts, like Brian and I are in our industry, and there's a big wave of people who don't actually know what goes into providing a school meal every day. And we're a bit of a, I guess, an anomaly in hospitality. Sort of, not many people know. And when you speak to people and say we can have 4, 5, 600 meals we have to prepare, feed within 45 minutes or an hour, there are some of the challenges people can't quite get their head around. And as Brian said, the bit that's, I guess, most frustrating, and I guess most sort of on topic at the moment, is the funding. So you mentioned about Wales, for example, our neighbours being so far ahead, 79p ahead, and the £2.61 we get isn't just for food on the plate. And this is something that Brian and I continue to sort of shout about constantly, because you can speak to any parent and say, I get £2.61 a day. They're like, oh, you can feed a kid for that, but you can't, because half of that goes straight to staffing costs. People aren't really aware of that. A percentage of that then goes into potentially equipment or breakages in the school kitchens, or training, or head office fees, or pensions, and all of these sort of bits that we actually have to take out of that £2.61, which is such a small cost. And even recently, as a business, we've been looking at, on the high street, real terms, what do you actually get for that? And you can't even get a McDonald's Happy Meal for that sort of money nowadays. So it's all, I guess, Dell's and sort of Brian's sort of ambition is to make people aware about, it's not quite as simple as people realise. That money is for food on the plate. There's a whole industry behind what we do, a whole sort of complex industry behind what we do, is what we're trying to shine a light on.
And how are you seeing that the funding impacts quality? And also, you mentioned, Brian, that there is some food service operators that do not want to compromise on quality, and then they have the schools subsidize it. But doesn't it end up just being one bucket or the other in terms of where the money comes from for this? Like, how do you see this also, impacts your guys' companies as food service companies providing meals for these schools?
Yeah, well, there's six examples this year alone of local authorities or businesses closing down because the funding isn't keeping up the pace with inflation. It's sad news because schools have been left in the lurch without a caterer. And may end up having to pay more because they're having to try and find someone at short notice. So that's a real problem here. And I don't know if in a report, so there's a cost of school meals report that was published around 18 months, 2 years ago. And what that said back then was the cost of a meal was £3.16. And with inflation now, it's around £3.45. And while and while that report came out, actually nothing's really been done to change the funding model or to support schools to be able to deliver that quality of meal. And then back to your point is there are schools out there who are saying, actually, I can't afford to deliver good quality meals, so I have to change to sausage rolls or pizza every day. And while that's not what people like myself or Luke do, there are schools who run services in-house and think, actually, that's the cheapest option and that's what we're going to go with. But so like I say, there's those companies that are closing down or organisations that are closing down. You have in-house operations who are just trying to make ends meet. And then you have businesses like ourselves who are saying, we're not going to compromise. Like, we want to make sure that kids get a nutritious meal every single day. But it's a real challenge to make the ends meet.
And how big a share of schools do you see actually pay a subsidy today, like across the UK?
I wouldn't know that information. I do know that what I've seen in our business is that the number of schools paying a subsidy is steadily increased. So if you think about just even from last year, national insurance increased, which meant that more schools went into a subsidy, an unfunded subsidy, because it's not as if the schools got more funding to cover that. We've then had food inflation and wage inflation on top of that. And that's created more and more schools heading into that subsidy position. I don't know, Luke, if you've got the same example.
We are seeing month on month now more schools fall into a subsidy position. And I guess, not to pinpoint any particular schools, but it's a real tough situation for them at the moment, because as Brian keeps saying about companies who want to offer a quality service, yeah. So we generally have schools that are on board with that. And when we started the journey with them, that's what they're really passionate about. And now we're having conversations with head teachers and business managers saying, that's what we bought into, but right now we can't afford it. What changes can you make? And we're having really tough conversations about changes to staffing hours sometimes, or can we tweak menus? But just to be clear, over the last couple of years, all of those, I guess, opportunities have been explored now. Everything. So we are now down to, this is probably the service that we can provide with food that we're still happy to feed the children, at the quality we're happy to feed the children, with the added value bits, while looking after our staff. And we're probably getting very, very, very close to the point now where there's nowhere else to go apart from the food on the kids' plates. And that's what I guess the headline is. We've done all that we can up to this point. The only two options is affect what's on the child's plate or push schools into further subsidies. And we're not talking maybe £100, £200, even a couple of thousand. We've got some schools now where if they want to offer the service that the head teachers want to give to their kids, they could be talking tens of thousands of pounds of subsidy. I had a conversation with a teacher a couple of weeks ago who said that's the cost of a teacher for them. And they get it. They don't blame us. They understand that's the reality of it. A separate conversation where a school's got a leaking roof and they're saying, we'll have to not repair our roof because we don't want to sort of change the quality of the meals we have. So for the head teachers that are involved and are passionate about what we do, they're having to make really tough choices.
Yeah, no, that makes total sense. And what is also like, as you guys see it, what are the impact of this if it continues this way?
The impact is, I guess, clear because they look. I do believe out of the around 20,000 schools that there are sort of in the UK, there is many, many more who want children to be fed well. Right? That's what I see from the people that we deal with. Fortunately, I know I can't make the decisions for the head teachers about how far they can push that and how long that can go. And we've gone from doing renegotiations with schools once a year, the annual sort of term of their contract, to having to talk to schools so regularly now, because if it's not food inflation, it's labour inflation. Then it's back to food inflation. And these changes can be month on month. So I guess the answer is for us, and I know Brian will be thinking the same, is we need to stick to the business that we are and the business that we've grown because we're really passionate and that's sort of what our brand represents. I guess the concern is that at some point teachers are going to be pushed, the head teacher are going to be pushed into a decision to make, which is going to be how much money they have spare. When they get to the point where they haven't got enough, then that's a tough decision for them to make.
And I also assume that that's a huge risk for the entirety of everyone that do school food across the UK, because at some point, if the school don't subsidize it anymore, you have two choices. Either you go out of business or at least are very, very, very pressured on that, or you significantly compromise on quality, but not even for small schools that may not even be achievable because of the labor.
But away from our businesses, this is, if Brian and I were to park our businesses, and I mean, I can't imagine if every business in the UK or every local authority went out of business, who's going to feed these children, right? Someone needs to feed these children every day. So there isn't the option or the possibility for us all to just disappear, because we're going to have millions of children every day who need food. I guess maybe the bigger concern I have is about being pushed into a corner where it's not the food that I want to be feeding children. And that's the next sort of big worry that we have as it gets tighter and tighter, which is why Brian and I so passionately every single day of the week shouting about more funding, because we just want to keep the quality high.
Yeah, I think from my point of view, like Luke said, every organisation has mitigated as much as possible since COVID, because we went through all of that pain of really high food inflation, high wage inflation and national insurance, and everything that can be mitigated has been mitigated. So it means now that you've only really got one option, which is the food on the plate. And unfortunately, that, like I say, that there's schools who are changing what they put on the plate. But for people like Luke and myself and plenty of other businesses and organisations out there, they don't want to compromise because there are a set of school food standards there to follow, which means that morally, we all want to provide a really nutritious meal to students. So one, there's a compliance part, but two, morally, we all want to do it. However, it goes back to that part of, I think that the wider school funding is a problem to be able to maintain that, because to Luke's point, you've got schools who will say, I can't afford it, because if that means I have to choose between great school food and a teacher, then unfortunately we're here to teach. So we're going to go with the teacher. So it's putting schools in a really difficult position to choose. And then unfortunately we're having lots of pragmatic but uncomfortable conversations with schools, because they understand the strains and pressures we're under, but they're also under the same pressure.
Yeah, because of course there is both the things you can control and there is the things that you can control here. And of course the inflation on the food prices, the labor and so on is something that is impossible for you guys to control. And then of course you have some other things that you definitely can work on your different companies. But how have you seen like the conversations with the schools generally being around the things that is out of your control? Have it been for the majority of schools? Because I also know that some of these contracts are longer contracts with fixed prices, and you like basically needing them to be able to renegotiate in order for actually to be just break even or profitable to operate some of these contracts at times.
The conversations are uncomfortable. They just are, because although most schools and trusts, whatever it might be, they have business managers who know the real world. And I guess you don't even need to be involved in our industry, right? The shopping that you bought in your basket from supermarket a year ago costs more today. Yeah, so everybody knows it in the real world. But it's still an uncomfortable conversation when you're sitting there asking schools for money they just don't have. They just don't have. And then having these conversations over the last couple of years, because there has been that period now where we keep having to have food inflation conversations, labour inflation conversation, national insurance. Nobody saw that coming. And that was mega for businesses like ours. They just become more and more uncomfortable. And to be honest with you, it's at the stage now where, as Brian said, there's lots of other companies out there who are also trying to do the right thing. So they might go from the pantry to IFG or whatever it might be, but we're all having a very similar conversations because there's only a certain amount of money. And I guess the most frustrating thing that's happened over the last week or two for myself and Brian, the whole industry really, is that you say about changes that are out of our control, national insurance, labour, food inflation, all those things. And now we've been hit with food standards that are improving. So Brian mentioned the school food standards, which will be in place. They have now been updated. They are due to come into play in September 27. And again, these are things that, as Brian mentioned before, we do this because morally we want to feed children well. And that's why we're part of the school food people. We could just continue to run our businesses, but we actually want better for children across the whole of the UK. And now we've been sort of another unforced change for us. The government decided to do this without, I guess, doing any of the work underneath the headline. So the school food standards changing, we all want to celebrate. We all want children to have the healthiest possible foods they can. Underneath the headline, there's not been any conversation about universal feeding, funding changes, any of those things. So I just feel that we seem to be jumping 6 or 7 steps in front, sort of championing and celebrating this headline. And as Brian and I shared so many sort of examples, we're still working on actually the foundations of getting this industry right.
Yeah, I was just going to say, so for the new school food standards coming out in 27 for primary schools and then 2028 for secondary schools, actually everybody's condoning that and supporting it and saying, yeah, it's the right thing to do. However, it needs to be sustainable in terms of properly funded. It also has to be thought about in terms of if you're trying to change the nutrition of a nation, actually, how do you step change that and do it in a way that means that students don't change to pack lunch? Because we've all seen bad pack lunches in our time, and actually that the school food standards are really important, but we don't want to divert people off to pack lunch, because then that actually puts the viability of the catering service under even more pressure. So that's the part of we are in full support of the intent of changing the school food standards to bring more nutrition, because we know that helps students attend school, they learn when they're in school and achieve when they're in school. It's that sustainability part in terms of sustainable funding, making sure that there's the correct guardrails there so that parents don't divert off to pack lunches, but also that education around what good food looks like and nutritious food looks like for not just the children, but also for the parents and the schools and everybody else, because it's really important that we get it right.
Yeah. No, and I think there's so many studies about the importance of these healthy meals at school. That's also why that from the European Union are different incentives and different programs now to push free school meals out to more countries. So I think it's really, really relevant and interesting topic. But I think it also drives to maybe some of the things that you can control. What are some of the changes that you at the pantry and IFG have maybe done to adapt to this situation as well on some of the things that you actually is within your control?
So for us, what we've been working on is, and I guess this hasn't been over the last few months. This is since COVID, right? So COVID came, shook everyone up, and at that point, food inflation really sort of started, or during COVID, then we led into it. I always say to people that COVID was a really tough time, actually, but for us in our business, the toughest time was the 2 years after COVID, because we didn't really get support of catching up with funding. Labour continued to increase. Obviously, the country was struggling. The bits over the last sort of 4 or 5 years we've been working on is becoming leaner as a business, trying to lean on technology wherever we can. We've exhausted that as much as you physically can, because we are a industry, hospitality generally, which is driven by people. Yeah, you have to have a certain level of people, and we employ hundreds of people, hundreds of people. And in other industries, probably with a similar turnover, they could do that by half the amount. That's just not options for us. We physically need people in kitchens to make food. We've been into the detail more than ever about menu changes, recipe changes, ingredient changes, and even not just to save costs. This is even just for the betterment of children, including maybe beans and pulses in dishes and vegetables, so on and so forth. So I guess to answer your question, all the things that we could do is changes to menus, more efficient staff-wise. All of those have been done, exhausted and looked at again and looked at again. The last remain in place, which is why I certainly dig in my heels in, because I just can't believe we're going to live in a world potentially where it might let this happen is the food on the kids' plate. And we just can't allow that to happen. And Peter, you mentioned about other countries doing it. There's 108 other countries in the world who universally feed their primary school children. 108, including Wales and Scotland, right? Our neighbours. And England just don't do it. And whenever you speak to anybody, I have no intention of sort of rolling that out in the near future. So we are being left so far behind now. It's becoming a bit of a national embarrassment, really, for me personally. But yeah, I don't see how any far we can go apart from funding to be increased.
I think from our point of view, we've very similar to Luke, we've looked at technology in terms of how we can streamline our business. There is a challenge because we operate in schools. It's not our environment. It's not our infrastructure. So it does create challenges to do that. However, that is something we're taking really seriously because actually it supports our teams to essentially do less admin and be out feeding students and educating students on what good food looks like. The other parts that we've looked at is around our recipe development. So because we make from scratch or cook on site, it allows us to engineer our recipes. So reducing sugar, reducing fat content, and things like adding more beans and pulses, same as Luke, where actually it does have a cost benefit, but actually it has a nutrition benefit. And that's really important to say that there's a lot of organisations out there, including mine and Luke's, and people within the school food people who have said, actually, we've been able to reduce costs, but there's been to a nutritional benefit to students. That's the world that we're in. So and I probably keep saying it time and time again, but we're in these businesses or these organisations to feed students good food. So any changes that we do make, it's for the benefit of the food that we're putting on the plate to give the child so that they have a better day and they have a great food experience. So we've mitigated as much as possible the things that are within our control. We are still working on things like technology. But when it comes to things like food, we've been there, done that. Labour, we've been there, done that. There's only so much we can do. And we want to look after our people as much as we want to look after the students.
And I've also, when you hear about then some of the things, of course, the government decided on, one of the things that they talk a lot about these days is also the free school meal expansion, where they are suddenly getting more people into that program. Maybe talk a little bit into how are you both looking at that change, but also generally maybe the importance of free school meal. In UK, of course, you have both the universal infant free school meal, you have the free school meal, and then you have the people that pay for the school meals from third grade and above. Can you talk a little bit into both that expansion and how you're seeing that, and also the importance of the free school meal?
Yeah, I think it's a fantastic scheme, so that an extra 500,000 students will qualify for extended free school meals under the Universal Credit scheme, which is great. But again, it goes back to this sustainable delivery of it. So it's still going to be at the £2.66, which is the rate for next year. So it's going from 261 to 266, which is 1.8%, and that doesn't relate to any inflation, food inflation or labour inflation. So it's creating actually a bigger problem because the funding doesn't support all of these additional students to be added to that free school meal mix, while, like I say, organisations like ourselves and people within the school food people fully support it, and we think it's well deserved to students who need it, and it's bringing more students out of food poverty as well. But that delivery is going to be a real challenge and put more funding pressures on schools. We also have the actual operational delivery of it. So because schools don't actually know how many people will qualify for it, it's presenting a real challenge for how is it actually delivered operationally. Schools have reduced their lunch times to, say, half an hour in secondary schools. So how do you feed all those students, especially if another 20% of students in your school become eligible for free school meals? So that's what we're looking at with our schools at the moment. We are, as part of the school food people, we are in talks with the DFE as well about how we give schools more information about to prepare for the increase in students who qualify. But you've got that real operational challenge. I think the big question I always ask people is, if you had 1,000 students stand behind you in the queue and you only had a couple of minutes to choose what to have that day, would you make a healthy choice every day? Probably not, because it's really difficult. So I think what we have to do is make sure that students have protected meal times schools to be able to make a real nutritious choice, as well as be able to sit and enjoy their meal and have a good food experience and good dining experience. So kind of back to the point of, it's a great scheme that we fully support. However, it needs to be sustainable. It needs to be operationally deliverable, and it needs to benefit the students to deliver them great food, not just a quick meal because the lunch times have been squeezed so much that they don't have the time to be able to make the correct choice.
Yeah. And that's what you're saying, Brian, benefiting the students. And this is what I guess with our school food people hat on, we campaign about all of the time, because I know I mentioned it when it came to funding a minute ago, but this is a fantastic headline, something we all support. We want to feed as many children. Great headline. Underneath the headline, I feel there's been barely any work done to see how we're actually going to do it. Back to the funding, back to the school food standards. These are fantastic headlines politically, but how is it benefiting the students? And if, as this current government has said several times about they want to create the healthiest generation sort of in history in this country, then we need to protect lunchtimes and give schools an hour and just say that has to happen, rather than in some schools you have 35 or 40 minutes. And Brian's mentioned it, and I was in one of our own secondary schools only a couple of weeks ago, where we do almost 1,000 meals a day and we get 45 minutes to do it. Yeah, so that for me is not creating the healthiest generation ever. That is just saying lunch has to happen. Let's just get it done, get it out of the way. And I think that if the government could create an environment where the school lunch hour, was as important as English, maths, and science, then all of a sudden everyone would start buying into it more. Everyone would get more excited about it. Everyone would make the right choices. Us as companies, we're able to put some, I guess, foundations in about how we make the right choices and how we can feed children the best meals that they can. At the moment, again, it's just another headline, one to celebrate. There's just a lot missing underneath about how it operationally going to make it happen.
No, it makes good sense. And of course, yeah, it sounds good. 500,000 more kids and more pupils are getting free food. But if you actually look from the pantry and IFG perspective, is it actually more beneficial for you as a company? Is it more profitable for you as a company to have the paid meals compared to the free school meals in this instance?
I wouldn't say it's more profitable. If anything, it's more of a challenge, because, like I said at the end, we all have financial models that we follow, and actually then whatever that turns out at the end is what's either returned to the school or a subsidy to the school. So economies of scale are great. So what you find in secondary schools is you do have economy of scale, and it can be less challenging. However, the other challenge that you have is the operational bit of getting 1,200 students through in half an hour. So that you trade off there. In primary schools, it becomes then about viability of the service, because they're smaller schools. You still have to pay your staff. You still have to pay for the food. So generally, in smaller primary schools, they are even more challenged when it comes to funding, because they have smaller funding to be able to pay for this service. So that's what it makes it really challenging for them.
Yeah, makes great sense. I think that's all what we've seen from technology standpoint. Of course, you can drive efficiencies, etc. But if there's only 2 people operating the cafeteria, the canteen, it's really hard to get down to 1. It's a lot easier to go from 10 to 9. So of course, there's a big parameter in terms of size here and some of the things that can be driven.
Yeah, and what we need to remember is a lot of these students may have been paying for meals already. So they may be moving from paying for meals, it may be £3, to then getting them provided for free for £2.61 or £2.66 from next year. So there's actually a drop in revenue for organisations, which then translates to a higher subsidy for the school. So that it's back to that, what I said in the beginning, that sustainable funding put in place to be able to deliver this.
Makes sense. Makes sense. And what are then, like, I know both of you guys are very engaged and actively advocating for the changes also with the politicians, etc. What is it, in your opinion, that need to change? Is it the funding amount that is the main thing, or is there also other things that you think is crucial to change on this? When you look at the funding, where should it go for you to be able to be in a position to provide the healthy meal sitter that you want? Is it closer to the Wales, Scotland, Northern Ireland number, or yeah, where do we want to go?
Yeah, for me, if I had a wish list, and there are several things I think would be on it, a lot of which other countries are doing, right? So that's, I guess, the frustration. But for me, the top 2 would be funding. We need just to get the schools back to a sort of a level playing field, and universal feeding for primary school children. I think to start with, if those two things happen, that would be the foundation of creating what the government keep sort of championing, shouting about. To give companies like us opportunity to go back to schools and really improve their food standards and their lunch times and have more of a conversation. Of course, like we always want to continue to sort of evolve as an industry, and food inflation will continue, right? And labour inflation will continue every single year when minimum wage goes up and these sort of bits. So I guess to link to that, have some sort of guarantees across every year when inflation goes up, sort of our funding will go up in line with that rather than falling so far behind some of the other countries. So I guess there would be the two on top of my wish list.
Very similar to, I think the wider school funding needs to be looked at so that schools feel they can afford £3.45 a meal, because that's what the cost of the cost of a school meal is in reality. That's not just come from organisations, that's came from a report that was commissioned, that was done by multiple organisations, and essentially showed it was £3.16 kind of nearly 2 years ago, and now it's £3.45. The other big part for me is when we spoke about the extended free school meals for universal credit students, that parents still have to apply for that. And there's a real disparity in the UK at the moment between parents being auto-enrolled into receiving free school meals. So if they're eligible, that automatically qualifies, and then the student gets it from day one, versus other regions within the UK where the parent has to apply, and if English isn't their first language, or if they don't know how to do it, then it can be really difficult for parents to do that. And at the end of the day, the only people who are suffering is a child who, at the end, who hasn't qualified for that free school meal that they should be getting, and the parent, because they may be paying for meals that they don't have to pay for. And I think that needs to be addressed, because you have some local authorities who are doing the auto-enrolment and others who are not. So it means that parents and students are missing out. And what they've seen is in local authorities where they do auto-enrolment, there's another 20% of students who are auto-enrolled. So it's quite a big number of people who either don't know to qualify, or don't know how to qualify, or just don't do it. And again, I feel it's the child at the end who suffers for that.
And maybe one last question in relation to this, and generally making the operation of school food viable if the funding does not change, because it seems like there's a pretty big chance that they will stick with the 266 for next year. We can all hope that that will change. But how much freedom do you actually have in the setup for the school? Now you mentioned there is schools that are subsidizing. Are you also allowed to increase the charge that you are charging for the paid meals? Are you even allowed to potentially charge extra for some of the ones that are on free school meal in order for them to get other meal options similar? Can you maybe talk a little bit more into what are actually the options that you have as food service companies to kind of go around this and try to provide meals in other ways?
I would say the options are quite limited, because as a provider, you want parents to be able to afford to buy meals every day. It's not like a treat. It's not like you go out at the weekend and you have a takeaway and it's a treat. This is a lunch daily. So what we can't do is charge over the odds for a meal to subsidise a service or subsidise the school, because the funding model isn't correct. So I think there's very limited options there, because you want to keep parents and students engaged in the service, because if they don't feel they can afford it, they'll be bringing in packed lunches. And again, it'll more than likely be unhealthy packed lunches. And I'm not saying that's all parents, but there are chocolate bars in there, there are crisps in there, there are products in there that shouldn't be there, and we're not allowed to serve in a school because of the school food standards. So I think there are very limited options, like I say, and I think we need to keep banging that drum about the wider school funding policy, so that schools feel they can afford that £3.45 a meal.
There's only so much that parents will pay. There'll be a cut off where they don't want to pay, and it's the same for schools. There'll be so much that schools will pay in terms of their subsidy, and that is as much as they can afford. And I guess that's what the options are. We continuously sit down with our schools and have the conversation about how far we can go, and we are also looking at the same with the parents. I mean, how much will they actually pay for a school lunch every day until it drives them away? And that's the only option we have over the next, until the funding changes.
Yeah, and of course you can also see in the uptakes that, of course, in universal infant free school meal, it's very high. 88.2% said the report from the UK government last year, where on free school meal kind of like high 60s and the paid meal significantly lower. So of course it also impacts uptake significantly, and how many that actually can get fed that healthy meal. So that's really great. I think here to end off the conversation, we're going to do a few quick fires on some of the things that we have been discussing today to kind of sum it up. The first one is very quickly, what are one misconception about the school meal economics?
But the one misconception is that the school meal funding we receive is all for the food on the plate. It's not.
I would say very similar in terms of, yes, we have to pay our teams, we have to pay our overheads, and we have to pay for the food on the plate as well. So when people hear £2.61, the misconception is that's loads of money for food. But actually, once you take off your staff costs and your overheads, you've got less than £1 really to spend on a 2-course meal. And I would challenge anybody to feed themselves for 95p a 2-course meal, let alone go and find a 2-course meal for £2.61 that's of good quality. So I would say that is a big misconception, which was, I would say, born out of COVID actually. Parents received £3 vouchers, which was fantastic that they got those vouchers, but there was a belief that all the money was for food cost.
And now during this call, we've also talked a little bit about some recommendations to the government, etc. But if nothing changes, what are one lever or one recommendation that you have to other operators, no matter if it's local authorities or other contract caterers, in how they should act in this environment?
I would say we all need to get together, and we all need to say essentially the same thing. So where school funding needs to be reviewed to make sure that schools feel that they can afford the meal prices that of £3.45 that comes out the cost of a school meal report. And we are all roughly saying the same things, but I also feel all the organisations and the campaigners who talk about feeding students really good nutritious food, and organisations like ourselves, we need to team up together to because essentially what we're all saying the same things, just in a slightly different way, and we all believe in what each other's saying, but I think we actually need to unify as one voice to make sure we're heard really clearly.
And the same for me, it's a coming together. As Brian said, companies like us who do what we do, campaigners do what they do, the government who are trying to, create the headlines that they do. If everyone could sit around the same table, have the same conversation, and even have a list of 10 things, you agreed on 7, right? We are moving forward. And directly, I guess, within our industry, we are getting closer, very, very close to even companies like ourselves. Like Brian and I work for different businesses, right? But we are really passionate about the same thing. And I think the more voices and the more business leaders and businesses that come together, our voice will be amplified. And that'll be my one request or hope, that more people can join our cause, because more voices heard is louder.
Yeah, to generally just fight for the industry as a whole, because it's a huge struggle, and that makes perfect sense. Which role do you see that organizations such as the School Food People, that I know both of you are playing an active role in playing in this?
We represent a number of organisations and suppliers across the UK, and I think the role of the School Food People is still to represent the people at the coalface who are doing the work every day, who are working through these challenges, to make them feel like they have a voice within government, within the DFE, within other organisations like campaigners, and bringing it together as one. And that's what we fight for every day, as well as providing them knowledge and information. So whether it's how do they manage allergens, how do they comply with the school food standards, and what about apprentice and training opportunities. Like, there's lots of things that School Food People do to support people within our sector. But I do think going forward, we do need to bring the campaigners and associations together to be one larger unified voice, so that we get real traction.
That's amazing. And thanks a lot for participating here, Brian and Luke. Really, really appreciate the time. I know you're both busy, especially these days, with both running the business and doing a lot of almost campaigning regarding this really, really important topic. So thanks a lot. And also thanks a lot for everyone that listened to this. Really, really appreciate it. Have a good day, everyone, and speak soon.
Thanks so much.
Thank you.